Okay, everybody, the GIMS team is delighted to welcome you all to our second online event, wherever you are in the world. Online looks as if it will be the new normal for some time to come, and whilst we miss meeting you in person, the wonders of technology are a boon in these difficult times. Now, I know that from those that have registered that many of you attending have come across us before or come to our meetings, which have been held across the country. So really good to see you again. For those of you for whom it is the first time, we give you a very warm welcome and hope that you'll continue to follow us. We aim to provide an educational platform to challenge the economic orthodoxy of the last 4 decades and more. And heaven knows there has never been a more important time to do so. The challenges of COVID-19 have revealed the cracks in our economic system like never before. And coming up behind is the even bigger tsunami of climate change, waiting to engulf us if we don't take prompt action. Understanding how governments really spend is the first and most important step forward if we are serious about creating a more equitable, fair, and environmentally sustainable world. So on that point, for old and new friends, just to remind you, GIMS has a comprehensive website, which is full of useful resources and links to external ones. And please do keep in touch by signing up to our newsletter for updates on future events. We can also highly recommend the MMT podcast with our MMT colleagues, Christian Riley and Patricia Pino, which is an absolute mine of information through its numerous interviews with MMT economists and other experts. So without further ado, I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our guests, Bill Armstrong and Bill Mitchell. Now, although a slight departure from our usual educational format, I'm sure this conversation will be every bit as informative and will most certainly provide some food for thought about where we are now and where we go from here. So, over to you, Phil and Bill.
Thanks, Prue. I hope you can all hear me. The light's a bit strange, as you can see. So Bill did say I was looking a bit like Uncle Fester with the light beaming off the top of my head. It's a great privilege for me, obviously, today to interview one of the greats of MMT, Professor Bill Mitchell. You'll all know a lot about Bill. Just a little brief intro about how I got into MMT very briefly. I am a post-Keynesian background and I read a lot about Paul Davidson. You'll have heard of him, maybe he's come to 90 in America. And I was watching an introduction to him on YouTube made by this guy called Warren Mosley. I'd never heard of Warren. I thought he seemed an entertaining guy. So I made contact with Warren and we're still close friends. And Warren mentioned to me this kind of Aussie guy, this Bill Mitchell, who was like the hardest working guy in the world. He writes like what we would take 6 months to write, and he writes it every day. And he writes in Billy Blog. Many of you will be reading Billy Blog every day. It's such an informative blog. I've learned masses myself about MMT. Pretty much everything you need to know from my point of view. If you look hard enough, Bill will have written about it. My job today is really to tap into Bill's wisdom and his experience, hopefully by asking the right sorts of questions. Bit of a pressure because I know Christian's listening and he makes his living doing this, and he's the man. Christian and Patricia have interviewed me on 3 occasions, and so I'm kind of learning from them. Firstly, when I turn to Bill, I mean, I know that you're a harsh critic of mainstream economics and indeed mainstream economists. So in a sense, my first question is a personal one for you. Well, what draws you to the study of economics? What motivates you? Does it go back to your childhood experiences, or does it come in later in your life? What drives you, Bill, in your study of economics?
Yeah, well, I mean, well, hello everybody, and thanks for taking your time out on a Sunday. It's very late here I'm on the East Coast of Australia. Thanks for taking your time, and thanks to Gims for organising this, and Phil for agreeing to be the sort of interaction. Look, I started off studying maths and philosophy and those sort of things. And then my studies were interrupted for reasons we don't need to go into, mainly due to Vietnam War type issues and the protest movement and all of that. And when I finally got back to university in the late 70s, by then the OPEC oil crisis had happened, and it marked the end of the social democratic era and the start of, monetarism had entered the academy and had infiltrated central banks and treasury departments. The first set of monetarist graduates had sort of come out. And, well, in Australia, unemployment if the unemployment during my childhood, if unemployment went above 2%, the federal government was in danger of losing the next election. It was held in, it was a massive thing for the population to have full employment. And well, my father lost his job as part of all of that. But by the time I went back to it was about to go back to university, unemployment was rising quite steeply. And I just thought that at that time, and during the interregnum, from when I first started studying maths and philosophy and history and those things, I'd read a lot, obviously, and I just decided that the real game, the real intellectual part of the class conflict, because I'd been reading a lot of Marx and that literature, and I just decided that the intellectual part of the class conflict had to be in the study of economics. That's really, I'd sort of worked out that's if the progressives were going to win the battle, then we had to become powerful on not just economics but macroeconomics. I was never the slightest bit interested in microeconomics. I was only interested in macro. I could do micro easily because I was good at maths, but I was interested in macro. And I thought that that's because the way in which the monetarists had captured the policy process and had started to create this fictional world about the capacities of government, which then were used as smokescreens to justify the unemployment they were creating. And so I had unemployment in my family with my father after a lifetime of work on minimum wage, and I had unemployment everywhere in society. So that's why I really went back and studied economics and didn't return to doing the arts type, humanities type stream. I kept up the maths, and the philosophy for a little while, but went into economics.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and that's great to get that sort of historical background from you. And now, if you're trying to summarise, if you envisage a world where MM3 was the new mainstream, I mean, it's quite a visionary thing. I mean, if you were going to summarise it, like for people who aren't so familiar with MM3, what sorts of things would you hope to see? If the mainstream was voted out and you guys were running if you like, running the show, people believed MMT and policies were informed by MMT, what might happen that would be different?
Well, I mean, take a step back so that we get it quite clear.
Mm-hmm.
One of the misperceptions or misconceptions that you see in the op-ed media, the social media, from critics, won't it be terrible if we ever have MMT? And from those who think that they have an inkling and they like what they're reading, won't it be great if we have MMT? And neither of those propositions makes any sense. And the reason it doesn't make any sense, and I've said this almost every time I speak, is because MMT is not a regime. It's a framework of thinking. It's a mixture of descriptive analysis, accounting structures, behavioural theories that have been mixed together to give people a superior understanding of the way the system works, the monetary system works, and most importantly, the capacities of the currency issuing government within that system, and the consequences of using those capacities in one way or another. So if you compare our textbook with a mainstream textbook, you'll see governments up in the very early chapters. Whereas if you look at a mainstream macroeconomics textbook, government's somewhere down further in. And that's because we think that you've got to start understanding from your initial starting point has to be the capacities of the government as the currency issuer. That's the starting point. Now, if you take that on board and you then ask me the question, well, what would life be different if we were in charge? And I'd say, well, who's we? And the reason I say who's we is because, and this is the second disclaimer I always like to put into the discussion, it makes really no sense to talk about a set of MMT policies, because we've got MMT policies now. They're out there because the system's MMT. And so when you're talking about we, it all depends who we are. Is that a plural or a collective or a singular? Anyway, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the point is that to operationalise that understanding that I mentioned earlier, you need to impose a set of values. And so, really, if we's Bill, then my values are left, collective, public goods, public education, public transport, strong public action on environmental, full employment, strong fiscal support that those who can't work, they're my values. But the people within the MMT community these days don't all share those values, and some of them, no names mentioned, are on the right.
Yeah.
And so their policy structures would, same understanding, they would have a very different set of policies. So if you're talking about there's certainly a progressive wing among the MMT academics, but there's also not a very progressive wing to some extent, and there's also centrists along the political spectrum, and they're quite different to those on the left. So that's my answer. Who's we?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say. I mean, I went to the city where I wasn't terribly welcome. I think that they invited a Labour MP, and their idea was, I think, in the City of London, if MMT was, in their terms, implemented in inverted commas, how can we still make money out of it? And what I found in there, it was a full audience, and what I was trying to say, you can't implement MMT. MMT it describes the world as it is, even though I had some economics professors saying it's been quote unquote implemented in Venezuela, as you can imagine, the usual stuff. Fortunately, Charles Goodhart was in the audience. He was the only one that gave me any support. The rest were all hyper critical, as you might imagine. But it's just what you said. These guys were thinking, right, if MMT became accepted, how can we make money of it? And politically, I absolutely agree with you, Bill. I'm a progressive on the left like yourself. I like you where you tell it straight, a bit like myself, as a slightly more English than Aussie. But I'm aware of what you say. I've noticed a few centrists who I talk to who like the MMT idea, but they accept MMT's theory, but their policy prescriptions that follow are slightly different. I might move as a development of that. I know you're writing a new book currently, which is really what I'd like to talk to you about in the next question. Your new book, what's that about? How does it link into your previous work? When might we see it? So I know you've got a new book coming.
Yeah, there's 3 contracts I'm writing at the moment.
3 new books, Phil. What a man. And the blog. Don't overdo it. We need you.
I'm still functioning. So, no, these are just, these are things that I do on a weekly, daily, weekly basis. And I just like writing, and I've just got a number of projects going. I think you're probably referring to the project I've got with Thomas Farzi. Is that true?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, well, this one is a sequel to Reclaiming the State. And for those who don't know or haven't read, Reclaiming the State was, Thomas and I started talking about maybe 8 years ago. And he organised a conference in an EU and European Commission type conference in Florence, and I was one of the guest speakers. And there was Yanis Varoufakis, me, there was a few others. And at that stage, we got to know each other, and Thomas was getting attracted to MMT. And because he had just written a book called Battle for Europe. And Battle for Europe was really a pro-EU book. And I sort of was trying to disabuse him of those ideas. And then he came out and spent a year at my research centre where we mapped all this out. And by then he had started to understand MMT. And he was clearly seeing that understanding, if you're on the left, doesn't make you a happy EU camper. You're not going to be, given that the EU is and particularly the Eurozone within the EU, the 19 out of, 27 states, is the sort of exemplification of how far you push the neoliberal agenda. And, he realised that the idea that we'll reform, all we need to do is reform the Eurozone and the EU. I think over a year of discussions, he formed the view that, as I always had, that the EU was unreformable, that the neoliberalism was built into the treaty structure, the very legal system of the organisation. And so by definition, to get rid of the neoliberalism, you'd have to get rid of the treaties, which gets rid of the EU. And what would come out of it's another matter. But so in Reclaiming the State, we wanted to work out why the progressive side of the politics, the socialist parties in, say, France and Spain, the social democratic parties in Northern Europe, Germany, the Democrat parties in America, the Labor parties in Australia and Britain. We wanted to work out why they'd become when they became neoliberal, and why. Why did the British Labor Party become Blairite, and why did the Australian Labor Party reflect that too? And so that Reclaiming the State was really tracing the turning points of when, from an MMT perspective, when those turning points occurred, and when those turning points were justified by building this fictional neoliberal monetarist type economic narrative. So in your country, the first neoliberal government was definitely not Maggie Thatcher. It was the the Callaghan government who was part of the second Wilson period. And Dennis Healey clearly was the first monetarist chancellor, no doubt about it. And, you know, when you've got James Callaghan up there in Lancaster in September 1976, saying that the age of Keynesianism and the age in which we thought that government spending could create jobs is over. That what government has to do is appease the world financial markets and fight inflation. And that's when Britain turned neoliberal. And all they did was Thatcher built on that. And the same story can happen in France with Mitterrand's austerity turn. And in Australia, for example, the Hawke-Keating government from 1983 to 1996, they paved the way for Howard and Costello in the same way that Callaghan and Healey paved the way for Thatcher and what on. And then the subsequent iterations of the Labor parties or whatever just were one step worse than those. And so Reclaiming the State was about that and what you can do about it, and clearly informed by MMT. There's clearly you can reject that whole global finance myth of dominating the nation state and the sovereign capacity of the currency issue and all of that. And so the second book is building on that. And the question we're asking really is, okay, so if the nation state has the currency capacity, which it clearly has, and what we did in Reclaiming the State was trace through how all of the major neoliberal components, the privatisations, the outsourcing, the austerity, the financialisation, the depoliticisation, all of the elements that define neoliberalism, which have basically, you know, really screwed our societies, they all worked through the state, through the legislative and regulative capacity. So this idea that the left had, that the nation state is powerless and they just have to appease the City of London. And, you know, this is what John McDonnell told me essentially when I met him a couple of years ago. You know, how do we deal with the City of London? Well, the right political agenda knew very well that everything, unless you have a militia and you invade a country, and they sometimes do that, like in Iraq, but unless you do that, everything has to work through the legislative capacity. And then, so the second book's exploring the idea that, well, what gives the legislative capacity the legitimacy? What is it that, and we're tracing this idea of a demos. And so one of the problems that the left became postmodernist in the 1970s. I'm old enough to, and so are you, to have experienced the whole, it's a compliment, to experience the way in which the left became postmodernist. And what I mean by that is that traditionally the left had organised around class and economic class. And it had then sought to understand society within that framework at the top, and then would understand identity with how it played out within the class politics. They didn't ignore identity, but they understood it within the initial organising frame of class, economic class. And once the left embraced postmodernism in the 1970s and got all cute, they abandoned class, the economic class, and they started to believe that you could understand people's location in society purely in ascriptive characteristics like gender or sexual preference or ethnicity and those things. Now, those things are crucial, but without the class overlay, you start getting diverted into political coalitions that are not progressive at all. So you can be on the side. So a worker, a female worker can identify with a female boss who's oppressing the working class because of the gender association, and who's who's a capitalist. And so you started to get all these perversions of the class struggle, and that became secondary. And so what we're trying to tease out in the second book is all of that stuff about, how does a government get legitimacy, and how does a progressive political narrative, how does it unite the working class? And so we've got situations now where, the some of the terminology like woke and all of this stuff, but you've got, and Brexit's, I think, a classic example. You've got a situation where the progressive left in, say, London have virtually no affinity with the left working class in the Midlands and the northern parts of Britain. And, so Brexit brought that right out, that tension and that conflict. And, you had these Labor Party characters talking about these ignorant racist people in the north of Britain. Well, they're the Labor voters, for God's sake. And so if the social democratic parties, whatever they're called, want to make a comeback, they've got to work out a way to bridge that conflict between the educated left who live in urban centres and who've done okay by globalisation, and the industrial left in the suburbs up in the north and in the outer suburbs of Australian cities, who have done very poorly out of globalisation. So that's the sort of themes we're looking at.
That seems very interesting. I'm looking forward to reading that. It's quite, what you say really resonates with me, because I'm from Middlesbrough. It's a northern working class town, and now I live in York, doing quite well. And what I found, I did speak to our European member of the European Parliament, and I talked to a lot of my erstwhile friends in the Labour Party. I since left under new management, which we may talk about a little bit later. And what I found is the sort of urban Labour members don't consider the state to be at all powerful in their narrative. They see that the EU is essentially some sort of bulwark against American-style capitalism. And I was talking to our MEP about that. He's just got this narrative in his head that, we can't do without Europe. Europe's not perfect, but without it, we'll be just like flooded out by this great wave of American-style capitalism. So, it's almost like they've abandoned their identity and said, we thrown the hands up and we can't do anything without the EU. And that's why I liked Reclaiming the State. And I thought the way it turned, we are powerful. The nation state is powerful with its sovereign issuing capacity. And I think that was a great book. And I'm looking forward to the next one. I have a little follow-up question, Bill.
Let me just say something.
Sorry, you come in again.
Yeah, let me just say something about that briefly. I mean, the idea of cosmopolitanism has been a left ideal forever. And every time, the first international, the second international, they all fell apart because of internecine disputes and aggro. And what I see about the sort of contemporary expressions of cosmopolitan type ambitions is that it's a really corrupted concept from the original concepts, which were a global world and a global fraternity and fraternity is not meant to be male in the way I'm using it, but the way in which cosmopolitanism is expressed within the EU concept is a really perverted form. And how can the EU, the EU inspired left, talk about this global vision when when the EU lets people drown at its borders? So sure, there's cosmopolitanism within the borders, but there's no humanity outside of that. And I think the migration crisis has demonstrated that very clearly, that there is really no unity. And moreover, I mean, just the way in which the North and the South interact within Europe it's a divergent organisation, not a converging setup. And think back to 2012, where front pages of Greek newspapers had Angela Merkel with Hitler moustaches, and Germany talking about taking over the Acropolis. And there's no unity, there's no cosmopolitanism. It's a real joke. And for the left in Britain to just hang their will and aspirations on that sort of system just tells me how lost they've really become.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with anything you say. I'm very much on the same page as yourself, Bill. And one thing I'd have to ask as a follow-up, and I wasn't aware of it, as Sarah mentioned to me, is this idea of this great reset that's coming out of the WEF, the World Economic Forum. I just wonder if you'd come across this narrative, and would you have any thoughts on it? For where do you think it's coming from? What do you think about it?
What are you referring to?
This Great Reset, I think it's called. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's coming out of the World Economic Forum. Have you come across that?
No.
No? Okay, well, I hadn't either. It's something that Sarah mentioned to me. But I feel better now if you've not heard of it. I think it's all these bigwigs out in Switzerland when they meet in Davos. They're trying to reset the world. But in a sense of the big question, what should we be supporting, I guess, if we turn it more on a British, during COVID, the government's obviously having to support businesses. It's got its furlough scheme. So I might ask you if you like, a two-part question. What should we support in Britain? What would you think a government ought to support? What types of businesses? If we are as we are now, and if we had a job guarantee, how would that make things different in your mind? So imagine you were in a governmental position. What would be your approach to supporting business in a crisis, with or without a JG?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Great Reset, by the way, I'm just recalling what I read a while back, is about dealing with technology and climate.
Yeah.
And so same agenda.
Yeah.
Look, what I would have said pre-pandemic is slightly different to what I say now that we've got a pandemic. Not much different, but a little bit different.
Yeah.
And one of pre-pandemic, the issues were very clear. You had a government that was starving your society of essential services, that had over many decades privatised out essential services, services that I believe should be in the public sphere, like transport, electricity and water. And in each of those, and this is not unique to Britain, this is everywhere.
Yeah.
And within each of those utilities or essential services, you'd had scandals, rorts, dysfunction. And, I remember one day I was on one of the major British stations, I can't remember which, and trains were just getting cancelled one after another because they didn't have enough crew on that day. And it was it was a southern service down to Brighton.
Yeah.
And so all of those experiments have to be undone. To move forward in an environmentally sustainable, equitable way, and what I mean by equity is that services should be proportional and accessible. Well, then you can't have these ridiculous systems, privatised water systems that flood because they've underinvested in maintenance and things like that. But the real challenge before the pandemic was climate and inequality. And those two things are linked, but they can also be separated. And so Britain really has to do what Australia has to do, and massively and quickly, and quickly, we mean within 10 years, I reckon, get out of carbon and get into renewables. Now, we're probably better placed here to do that than you are, because of sunlight and all that sort of stuff, but it's not impossible to do it there. That's going to require a massive transformation of production and consumption systems, not just a little tweak here and there. That's a massive transformation. And the only way that can occur is with the government playing a central role as both a producer and an investor and employer. Now, the question then is, if you're going to have a massive transformation of production and consumption patterns, like all, and it's got to be done fairly quickly, then that's going to be very hurtful to some communities. So in Newcastle, where I'm currently living here, up the valley is all the coal mining. And I'm talking here about a kilometre, less than a kilometre away is the port of Newcastle, and that's the largest export port in the world. And coal export. And within 20 years, that whole industry is going to have to close down for environmental reasons. It's being heavily resisted by the industry and the Conservatives, but there's no doubt it's going to have to shut. But there's all these communities up the valley, these towns that rely on that industry. They're in the same way when I was studying in Manchester during the 80s, and Maggie Thatcher was progressively shutting down the mining industry in Yorkshire and Wales and other places. Those communities were really damaged by that. And so as part of this transition that the government has to pursue, and it's certainly not pursuing it, there's got to be a just transition framework put in place. And that framework requires significant investment in research and development. It requires buyouts and compensation. It requires major re-education going into the universities and vocational sector. It requires lots of investment in research and innovation and manufacturing. So renewables can be the next really deep vertically integrated sector where you have lots of different occupational structures within the industry. So it's not just research and development, it's manufacturing of equipment, it's sales and administration, it's technicians, support, maintenance, design, all of these different occupations. So it gives us, and the research we're doing in Australia demonstrates that it actually ultimately, believe it or not, leads to more high-paid employment than the high-paid mining jobs up the valley. So there's got to be all of that go on. Now, you mentioned job guarantee. A lot of MMTers get very excited about a job guarantee, and I often hear them, and this particularly in the American context, they talk about, oh, the job guarantee is going to be the solution to the dislocation. Well, the way I've always thought of the job guarantee, and I first started developing the idea in 1978. That's when I first wrote the first paper on that, the wool. And the job guarantee should be thought of as being an incredibly small scheme. It's not a panacea at all. It's hardly anything, in my view. It's just one element in a total safety net, societal safety net, that there's always a job for anybody who wants it. But I think the transition that we're talking about will require substantial number of career, high-skilled, high-craft jobs within the public sector that are well beyond any conception of a job guarantee. Job guarantee is just a small part of the whole thing. And so progressive MMTers shouldn't always say, oh, yeah, we'll be able to have a job guarantee. That's the solution. No, it's not. It's hardly any part of the solution, but it's a very important part.
Yeah, it's very easy to hear your insights because I've not really thought of it in those terms. So thanks for that, Bill. Now, I might just move briefly on a bit onto politics. I know you're quite outspoken on your, shall we say, criticism of the UK Labour Party, amongst other things. Now, obviously, I believe the latest slogan here from Keir is under new leadership. Now, it's difficult. I mean, like many people, I joined Labour when Jeremy's leadership was there. I'm not saying by any means what he did was perfect, but at least there was a vision. You know, I trusted his integrity, personal opinion. Now with Keir Starmer in charge, I mean, you could almost take two views. I've noticed on Twitter and social media, the people at the leftists who are very antagonistic towards Keir. And there are those like myself. My view is really the left needs to keep him under pressure. My view is if you stand a socialist candidate, I'd vote Labour. But if you stand somebody who I don't think is a good candidate under my terms, then I won't. I just wonder what you would say, what from your politics, and you might include MMT, but just from your personal politics, what would your attitude, if you lived in Britain, what would your view be of the new Labour and its leadership?
Yeah, well, I think it's unelectable, but
well, I agree. Yeah.
Look, I thought Jeremy Corbyn was a really decent guy, and I think he's. I don't have a view because I'm not all that informed on his personal management skills. I mean, I've read about them, and some other Labor politicians who I know have told me about them, but I think he was a genuinely nice guy of that old left tradition, and he was hijacked. I mean, look at this guy, Tom Watson. What's he up to now? He's working for a betting company or something?
Yeah, that's right. He is.
And he, 10 years ago, he was saying that this company, they're just greedy, grasping just for money. And now he's gone out and working for them. So those sort of things, that whole anti-Semitism beat up, the way in which they abandoned the Leave voters was really crazy. I remember when I met with John McDonnell, I said that if you don't become the Leave Party of Britain, then you're history. That was a few years ago, and he said, "Oh yeah, but the majority," and his offsider, his advisor, said, "Oh yeah, the majority of Labor voters voted to remain." And I said, "Yeah, that's true, but the majority of your MPs are representing Leave seats." And that was just because of the difference of those two views was just the concentration of Remainers in London seats. But the majority of Labor MPs represented Leave constituencies in Britain. And in my view, that the Labor Party had to become the Leave Party because that's what they promised. And now, when I read the British press every day, obviously, and I read the speeches and I follow it. And the current leadership how could the British people even trust them? In the sense that a few months ago, they were saying, well, as soon as we get re-elected, we'll get us back into the EU. And now they're mouthing these things, let's just get it done. You know, if it was so bad, why wouldn't they? And I think their view on Remain was wrong, but it was Starmer's view. I mean, he was one of the key Remain men. And for them now to sort of swing and hold a different position, I just don't think that's viable for them. And some of the commentary coming out from the Shadow Chancellor, and I've got no view on her personally. It's none of this is personal. Is just mindless, and they have not learned the lesson of that stupid fiscal rule that really they'd set up the narrative that they were going to be fiscal rule driven, and then they go to the election with their manifesto promising the world, and it was quite obvious you couldn't do both.
Yeah.
You couldn't have done both. And I mean, just the fact that they changed the fiscal rule on the quietly a couple of weeks before the election, because they had realised that their stupid rule was and I wrote letters to them and told them that this fiscal rule was impossible to sustain within your agenda. And guys like who were advising McDonald were saying, no, I'm just an idiot. And you know, some of the designers of the rule were on Twitter saying that I didn't know what I was talking about. But they couldn't possibly have run that manifesto with a fiscal rule. Now, the British electorate aren't stupid. They formed and the reality was that their manifesto was totally achievable within the fiscal capacity of the government, but not within the fiscal narrative that they'd set up. That's the difference.
Yeah.
So they'd sort of shot themselves in the foot. And until they stop doing that, I don't believe they can articulate a progressive manifesto. So, you know, it's the same as the Australian Labor Party. They don't take the advantage when they first go into opposition of re-educating the electorate before the next election. And so they get trapped into being this sort of deficit hysteria, attacking the government.
Yeah.
And then they end up inheriting a mess themselves. And that's, I think the Labor Party have not learnt from the last experience. I don't think their leadership has learnt. He's smoother than Jeremy Corbyn, for sure. He's obviously very well appointed in his appearance and his coiffure, but there's no change in narrative as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes on Twitter, you get supposed Labour supporters talking about how past Labour governments have been much more stringent with the public as this is good. It's great, you know. We're tougher on the finances, which is quite amusing to me. This is a tricky question, Bill. And when I talk to people, okay, they always say, surely government politicians know this. Their natural inclination is, in my case, certainly I'm a comprehensive school teacher from Middlesbrough. How can I know more than all these guys that go to Oxford and Cambridge and stuff? It's not possible. Surely they must know. And I always say, well, by and large, politicians don't know how the system works. They might have an inkling, but if they get a bit more, they kind of close the door. They don't want to know. It's dangerous. Now, in a sense, when people are asking me, or indeed any of our MMT activists, one of the standard questions when you explain it to them and probe how the system works, the natural inclination is, we've been manipulated, you know, they must know it. And I say, not really. So what would your reply be to, you know, if you're an MMT activist, you know the score, when you get these, do the politicians know, how much do they know? In general terms, what would your reply be?
Well, you know, I've interacted with politicians for a long time and most of them don't know it. Most of them take their advice from their advisors. And what they end up mouthing is given to them by their advisors. Now, some know it, some don't, but most of them don't. Most of them have just bought the narrative. And that's been my experience over, a fair few number of years now interacting with politicians. There's some that do know it, and there's some that are happy to manipulate the fiction. And I think that's being revealed a bit now, given the scale of the crisis the globe is in now. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Guardian headline the other day relating to the statement of the Australian Treasurer.
No, I missed that.
Well, he said that the days when we worry about deficits and debt are over. Whoa. Now, this is a conservative government, a conservative government, which is actually more conservative than your government, which is only 6 months ago was celebrating getting close to a surplus, even though unemployment was rising and GDP growth was falling. So this is a real neoliberal, nasty, malicious government who have been dragged into having to recognise that their whole narrative about debt and deficits is over. They can't sustain it. They said they're not going to worry about the deficit until unemployment comes down. And so somewhere there they know it. And certainly, see, the other problem is that the Treasury departments are full of people that don't know it either, because the way in which economics programs are run, they're like closed shops. They're not educational programs, they're indoctrination programs. And unless you're willing to read widely outside of the standard program these days, you get one line pushed. And I saw a tweet, I think it was yesterday or on Friday, it was someone from Harvard tweeting that Gregory Mankiw is still teaching loanable funds theory.
Yeah, I saw that,
Yeah. So it's just this really blinkered view. It's when I first started studying economics, it was still a contest of ideas. So the textbook still presented a contest of ideas, and then by the early 80s, the textbooks shifted quite dramatically to presenting just one view, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply view, bang. And then that morphed into rational expectations in the later years and all of the Sergeant Wallace stuff and what followed. And so it was a really narrow, blinkered view. And that's what graduates get. We know from studies from social psychology that economic students, by the end of a third-year program, an undergraduate program, start developing socio-pathological tendencies. They do surveys and they start to, and by the end of a graduate school, the sort of program that I went through, a vast majority of them are displaying those sort of tendencies. They go into Treasury departments, blinkered view, bang. And I think that's the problem. And they then become, the political aspiring ones become advisors. And even those on the left, the progressive advisors have come through that view. And, I've spoken at length to some of the political advisors in Britain, and they're on the left, advisors to the Labor Party. And they are sucked totally into the sort of new Keynesian monetary policy has to be primary. You would only use fiscal policies in certain instances, blah, blah, all of that orthodoxy. And they're the Labor Party apparatchiks.
Right. Are you happy for me to keep going with a few? I've got a few more questions, Bill. I know it's late for you. Can I keep going?
No, keep going. And if any, we're going to allow questions from the audience too.
There are some coming through. I'll finish mine and then see how you feel. It's late for you, Bill. I mean, basically what I want to do is really more putting my thinking from the point of view of MMT activists, and I've got a few ideas Sarah and Prue and Claire have put to me. One of the big things is the trade question that MMT, how it puts forward exports as real costs, because as you'll know, in conventional economics, exporters are lauded as these sort of saviors of the nation. Now, the trade aspect of MMT, in many ways, is the hardest thing to sell. So I go back to the MMT here in the pub with an open-minded guy, who says, what about the trade? What would be sort of your advice for someone who's trying to talk about MMT's, if you like, insight or lens onto the trade aspect? How would you approach that in a straightforward way?
Yeah, I mean, this has been one of these areas where those with pretensions to be MMTers or progressives have demonstrated, and we won't name names. Look, it's just so obvious. If you're in a pub, ask someone if they've got an iPhone in their pocket and ask them whether it's a benefit or not.
It's good start.
Ask them whether it's as useful for them. Look, it's so obvious that if you are using your real resources, labour, capital, raw materials, and you're putting the outputs of those resources onto boats or into planes, and you're sending them to some other country, then that has to be a cost to you. Why? Because you're not getting the benefit of those resources. It's just obvious. And if someone else is prepared to put their resources and the products of their resources onto planes and send them to you by ship or plane, and you get boxes of iPhones and computers and motorbikes and whatever else you can get, then it's obvious that that's a benefit to you, because you've got those things that you didn't previously have, and you've given up. They're not your resources. Someone else has given you their resources. So then if you think about, if you're getting more of that stuff on ships to you for less, in return for less of that stuff on ships to them, then your terms of trade are in your favour. Because at the end of the day, we measure material happiness by our consumption possibilities. That's the reality. We think if we can consume more, we're better off in a material sense. Now, we can challenge the whole mass consumption ethos for sure, but that's the way we think. And so if we can persuade people from abroad to send more of their resources and consume less of their own resources and give them to us, and only expect less back in return from us, well, then we're better off in net terms. And Australia's been running an external deficit since the 1970s, and countries have been prepared to do that for us for 50 years, and we're better off in material terms. There's no doubt about it. Now, then the question is, what happens? And the reason they're doing that, the foreigners are doing that, is because they want to accumulate claims in financial assets in your currency. Because that's the quid pro quo. Okay, so why would you ever want to export if it's a cost? Well, obviously you want to export if you have to export to get the imports. That's obvious too. And so for a country that doesn't want to import anything, they don't need to export anything, quite obviously. And so exports are a means to an end. And if in pursuing that means to an end, you can come to a terms of trade that are in your favour, well, then you're doing well. Now, so then what the progressives say, and they're valid arguments, and it relates to something I missed out saying before, which I'll come to, is that, okay, well, they've got these financial claims in your currency now. They hold your currency. What happens if they want to buy up the country? like the Russians want to buy all the London real estate. Well, that's not an outcome of trade. That's an outcome of lax foreign investment review type controls. So the legislative capacity of Britain could always legislate to manipulate the way in which foreigners who hold British pounds use them within Britain. That's obvious. Australia used to have a Foreign Investment Review Board, which prohibited foreigners from buying certain assets, like land or housing or other things. That's obvious. And the Australian government regularly refuses foreign takeovers on national interest grounds. That's within the legislative ambit of the government. Now, then the next thing that people say is, well, what happens if they sell off all of that currency? Well, they make the loss. And so why? So they're not about to do that. That doesn't very often happen in history. So that's unlikely too, because then they're just guaranteeing they lose massive amounts. And then there's the third point, and this has some validity, and I think it's now got more validity. Remember, I said what I would recommend before the pandemic and after the pandemic would be slightly different, and I didn't actually finish that. I think there's now a sense among our national governments and the people that a certain degree of self-reliance is going to be a good thing into the future. Now, for example, Australia found itself short of PEP stuff, you know, the protective equipment for our healthcare people, like masks and stuff. And we bought all this stuff from China that turned out to be all these masks. I can't remember how many million worth, which were useless. And things like that. And I think there's now a debate, and I think it's happening in most countries, that we're going to have to become less reliant on global trade for key essentials. And this goes back to the old arguments of protecting manufacturing sector and building up a manufacturing sector, even though it might be less efficient in unit cost terms than, say, what you could get from imports. You protect it because for national security reasons, or in our, you know, in this modern case, we're now retooling some of our firms to produce respirators. Yeah. Because we didn't produce any respirators at all. So suddenly we're now seeing that these sorts of things, it's actually useful to be self-reliant if this is going to be the way of the future. So on the trade thing, I just don't get it. And the final part of that story is, well, what happens if the global capital sell off your currency? Well, then you can do what Iceland did, who had endured the biggest banking collapse in history. They tied up two of the largest hedge funds in the world with capital controls and successfully kept their currency from collapsing. That's what you do. You can tame global capital anytime you want to.
Right, I mean, absolutely agree with you on all those points, Bill. And I hope all the listeners are now fully equipped next time they're allowed in a pub, socially distanced. When they get the but what about trade, they're all ready to answer the questions, and that's much appreciated.
I mean, there's one other element to that, and that is the problem of less developed countries.
Yeah.
And what we mean by less developed, that's a very loaded term, of course, because it means less capital developed. And so what MMT teaches you is that a currency issuing government can always make sure that all the resources that are available to a country are fully used. That's one of the implications of that understanding. But that doesn't mean that will yield high material standards of living. If a country is resource poor, well, then clearly you can make all of the resources that it has, which aren't many, fully used, but that mightn't deliver very much prosperity in material terms. And I think that in Reclaiming the State, we talked about this problem that that to me is what the responsibility of multilateral institutions are. And so you scrap the IMF and the World Bank and you create a new institutional structure where you make sure that countries that haven't got anything to export, so they can't get more resources via trade, you make sure they get the resources through international transfers. So that's a qualification that is obvious in poorer countries.
Yeah, I mean, again, I've written a little bit about that myself. Absolutely agree with what you're saying there. What I'm going to pick up on something which you've alluded to, Bill, and we can I guess take it as a measure of success of MMT that as a movement and a community, shall we call us some bogus MMTers out there who kind of try and ride on its back? As you say, not mentioning any names. I mean, I find I mean, hey, I'm not saying you can do what you like on that one. I mean, I find it really irritating, I've got to admit, and I'm not, if you like, a core player. You know, I mean, I think of you, Warren, and Randy as like the big three originals. You know, and it must be in a sense because it's to an extent the movement you guys started. Suddenly, you're getting guys who are jumping on it a bit and. Perhaps, shall we say, railroading it for their own purposes. I mean, how do you kind of deal with it in your own mind? I mean, I find it hard, as I say, and I'm not a new kid on the block, but certainly newer than you.
Well, we started it. So, look, Warren and I have spoken about that a little bit. He's probably a little bit more concerned about it than I am. I just think that they're obviously frauds. Let's say it straight. There's now a group of careerists, let us say, that have sensed the wind direction, and they've hoisted their sails, and it's been going on for a little while now, and someone I read said, "Oh, well, Bill Mitchell doesn't know what MMT actually is."
Whoa!
And you can guess who we're talking about.
I can, yeah. And I saw that. I was mad. Not as mad as you, but I was mad.
Well, I wasn't mad. I couldn't give a stuff about it. I mean, the point is that I would have thought that, yeah, look, and it's when I started to talk about post-MMT,
I saw that, yeah.
I started to talk about post-MMT, and look, anybody can take bits and pieces of it for what they want, and do what they want. That's fine with me, but I would have thought that what constitutes the body of work is what started with Warren and myself, and then Randy.
Yeah.
And all of that work was done in that period. It's been expanded and developed, of course, but the main ideas were there in that period. And well, that's what MMT is. Yeah. And if you don't like elements of it, well, then that's fine. Free world, sort of. But if you don't like elements of it, then you're free to go and do your post-MMT stuff. But to then say that you're an MMTer and the original MMTers don't actually know what MMT is. It's just a reflection of a sad mind, a fraudulent type approach to public discourse. And look, I get slammed on social media almost every single day, and if I bought into it, I'd go insane. And it's water off a duck's back to me. There's obviously fragmentation going on now, and that's clear. And in a way, the progressive side of politics always fragments, and that's the way it is. And I just, you know, my work's out there for posterity. What's been done's been done. Where it started from, everybody should know that. And I just keep chugging along doing what I'm doing, and these characters are frauds basically. And I think that the whole social media, and I've said this quite regularly now, the social media empire that's been built by them or been built around them is not helping us at all. And the fragmentation isn't helping the progressive side at all. And just look what's happening into the American debate now. I mean, you know, how could Trump be re-elected? Well, he possibly will be re-elected. How could have Boris Johnson been elected? I mean, given that they're one of the worst Tory governments, worst governments of all time. But that's because the progressive side of politics fragments always as stupid careerists who those emerging out of MMT are of the same ilk.
Yeah, I mean, again, I absolutely agree with everything, but I just wanted to say on behalf of everybody, if I can be permitted to do that, we do appreciate what you're doing and have done from the founding of it, and you know, the blog that you do. We appreciate that original thinking that you and Warren and Randy slightly later have produced. You know, it's much appreciated, and I think on your behalf, I think, you know, it's water for ducks back for yourself, but for those slightly grumpy, bad-tempered guys from the northeast of England, we can feel it on your behalf, a bit vicariously, you know.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, the problem is that I see people getting lured into these discussions, especially on Twitter, because I don't use Facebook, but I see getting, but Louisa tells me it happens on Facebook too, and I just think you don't give any of them oxygen. If you starve a fire, it goes out. And these characters are trying to make a name for themselves. They're trying to product differentiate. They're getting Patreon subscriptions and all sorts of sort of nefarious types of ways in which they're trying to build a reputation as key advisors to this and that and what have you. And if you give them oxygen, they burn brighter. And that's why I have a rule. I never get sucked in on Twitter. Every day I'm getting provoked and I never respond. It's just a waste of time.
Yeah, I've read you say the discussion is dysfunctional, and I agree with you on that. I might just ask you, follow that. I'm keeping an eye on the time. I mean, I could talk to you all day, Bill. And I
said to Sarah and the gang that I can go until 2300, so keep going.
Well, in this one is more like and I know there's a few questions I'm reading. Your time, yeah. Whoa, I was looking at a few questions coming in. There's a lot of interesting ones. I mean, one of the things for MMT activists, you know, having you on the screen, obviously there's this thing of what should we do about political parties? What should, you know, if you're in Labour, should you stay? Should you? I know it's all personal for you, or if you're involved in pressure groups, if you meet interested individuals in MMT, you know, and there'll be people listening in. There's a lot of people listening for different stages. You know, there's guys like me been around maybe 10 years, there's newer ones, people who are just learning and want to talk. Have you got any sort of, I don't know, hints for dealing with political parties, pressure groups that you're in, you know, that might be open-minded? What would you say to these people now?
Well, what we're doing in Australia is, and it may not work, but we're thinking about creating a new political force, a new political dialogue. My view is that the progressive side of politics, the traditional progressive voices, no longer give voice to the working class. They've abandoned that position, and as they've abandoned that position, they've built up a culture and institutional structure that makes it virtually impossible for them to change. So you think about the British Labor Party, how it got itself into the mess in December 2020, where it lost an election to a government that had devastated the country with austerity since when? May 2010. It's when Cameron was elected. And before that, Blair. But how could the Labor Party not win that election? Well, you just had to see the way. In the way I saw it was that there were elements in that party that were happier to lose than to articulate a winning agenda because of the personal differences, the factional differences, the cultural differences. They were happier to kill off Corbyn and lose the general election to Bojo than display solidarity. And same in the Australian Labor Party, for example, the right and left and centre factions are poisonous and will never form a coherent progressive voice that is electable in a way that you'd want to have a progressive party. So I think their time's up. I think if you go right through Europe and, the Democrats how could they put up Joe Biden, for God's sake, and then Kamala Harris as his deputy? How could they do that if they wanted to represent a progressive voice? These are these parties that are inertia prone, captured by corporate interests and funding bodies who have outlived their usefulness. And I think the only way to progress is to use the modern instruments of the internet and social media communication, because that's changed the way in which people can network and interact. You no longer need as big a corporate funding to get messages spread and to create new political forces. That's the only way, from grassroots up. And if the progressive side of politics wants to articulate the voice of the working class, well, they better stop calling them racists and idiots and start addressing their concerns. Now, that's not to say that some of the things that come out of working class movements or communities are everything I would agree with. But most of the things that I would disagree with are matters of education. But you can't tell... You can't turn around to a working class community and say you don't stand for full employment. Yeah. You just can't do that. Because they, or that you want to have UBIs, that you want to have people who can work who just refuse to work. That's not going to win your votes. That's the woke urbanites who want that sort of stuff, and so we've got to work out a way to bring all of the progressive forces together into new movements, and I'm not so sure that can happen very soon.
Yeah, I mean, it is going to be a challenge. I mean, that kind of is my last question. I'll move on to, which follows from that, really, to sum up. If you're assessing the progress of MMT, and you can interpret that any way you want, in terms of economics education, you talk about the textbook, how's that doing? What about in a global context? How, if you kind of give an overview of how MMT education is progressing, particularly if you can end on a high note for all our listeners, what would you say, Bill? Have you seen any progress? Does it excite you?
Well, I mean, when Warren and I started with Randy, we used to say you could count the MMTers on one hand.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we got terribly excited when we spilled over onto the second hand.
Yeah.
And now we've got all around the world, we've got the IMF head, the central bank governors, the European Central Bank bosses, Japanese government heads, all talking and mentioning it explicitly, either hatefully or not. And if you study the Australian press, almost every week now there's an article on MMT and my work and things like that. And my diary is really full at the moment and one of the real big shifts, and you mentioned the financial markets earlier. For a long time, I was doing a lot of workshops for progressive groups like grassroots citizens type community groups. I do a lot of workshops now for the large investment banks and the large pension funds, and they're wanting to know about MMT. Now, the real problem for me there is that I've got to walk this fine line. I don't want to make money for them, but I want to educate. Because if I educate them, they are the ones that bring pressure on governments. And, you know, I mean, just on last Wednesday, the Tasmania, it's only small, but the Tasmanian government, which, you know, state government in Australia, voted to explore the idea of a job guarantee. Now, that's a conservative government got rolled by the Greens, the Labor Party and an independent. And they got rolled, and the Conservative Speaker of the House in Tasmania voted against their own government. And the motion came out of a briefing paper that we gave them. So when I look at it now, yeah, it's everywhere now, and the paradigm shift is definitely happening. And you're seeing a lot of mainstream economists trying to get on the right side of history by saying, oh, we knew it all along, or all of these things. That's fine. You know, I think that Warren and I always had the view that if everybody got it and then took credit for their own credit for getting it, that'd be okay. It wasn't about getting credit, because then the world would shift in the way we wanted it to shift. And so these characters that say, oh, they knew it all along, you know, this is fine. That's fine by me. If they're mouthing our ideas, that's fine. And there's all these people out there now that are mouthing the original ideas of ours. I'm happy about that. That's fine. They don't have to say they're MMTers, because the narrative shifting and the debate shifting, and moreover, the way governments are behaving is shifting. So we've now got governments not even worried about massive deficits. We've got central banks buying lots of government debt, basically funding the deficit straight. We've got British government expanding the Ways and Means account in the Bank of England. You know, not even oh, we've got to be careful. They're just doing it. So in effect, they're exposing to everybody what their fiscal capacity is, what their monetary capacity is. And as time goes by, we're seeing the consequences aren't as the mainstream predictions were. I mean, Japan sewed it up years ago, but it's happening in all of our countries now. And the citizens are working out, well, bloody hell, here are the huge deficits. Where are the interest rates going up? Where's the inflation? Where's the bond yields going up? They're learning, and politicians are going to find it very hard now, stepping back and reinstating that deficit terrorism sort of stuff, that fiscal sort of austerity narrative. They're going to find it very hard to pull that same stunt again.
Yeah, that's all positive. I mean, I think I might be something you said when I interviewed you sometime, Bill, about, you know, when MMT's the mainstream, then we know we'll win. And I was sort of it could be, I don't know how many years, you know, depends if we're optimistic, some undergraduate will go into a university library and find a book waiting for recycling, and it'll be a bit dusty, and he'll bring it and go, Professor, I found this old book here. It's by Gregory Mankiw, Macroeconomics, and he'll blow the dust off. And they go, yeah, the prof will say, well, yeah, we used to use that, but not anymore. And then,
when I was talking to these Tasmanian people the other day, when they were working out this motion to put before the Parliament, I was told something interesting was said, and that is that, and it really resonated. He told me, he said the political representatives are all conservative neoliberals.
Yeah.
But he said increasingly on the Labor and Greens political side, the apparatchiks, the advisors, the researchers for the political parties are becoming more MMTers.
Yeah.
And if you go back to what the famous quote that paradigm shift one funeral at a time.
Yeah.
The idea that the old guard, the old professors, they eventually have to retire and die out, and then the younger ones who have been a little bit scared to say anything, but because of their careers, but they're the ones that have been reading the new literature and getting new ideas. As soon as the dam breaks and the old guard leave, the new guard are already equipped. And that's what I learned from that last week, that all these young political advisors and researchers who become the next generation of MPs, who stand for Parliament, they're all becoming MMTers. That's what he told me. And so I think that's the way paradigms shift. And I think we're in that process.
I agree. It's exciting. Randy, as you know, is a man of few words, and I met him in Italy for an interview. It was brilliant. I enjoyed the trip. It was great. And I asked him the question, when will MMT take over? He just looked to me as he does, a little pause, and went, I won't do the accent, when the old guys die. And I think, in a nutshell, it's absolutely what you're saying.
The old guard are going. It's just a matter. It's a temporal issue, and the more the younger people coming through with new ideas, this is the way it happens. And I remember back to, because I was going into graduate school, as monetarism was becoming really intense, and all the young people were becoming monetarists. Every one of them. Not me, but the majority of the young postgraduates who were the next generation of professors. They were all becoming monetarists, and I think what's happening now is that you'll start getting a shift.
Yeah, well done, Bill. He's like in Lord of the Rings. You could carry the ring when all around were turning against them. Good job, you didn't swallow it. On that note, there's an MMT activist I'm sure you'll know very well called Neil Wilson. Been around MMT for a while. He's got an idea of working out how we might approach politics. So we may, via the GIMS, get in touch with you for some sorts of advice. And so that's to come, I hope you'll be okay to give us a little bit of advice and your wisdom.
What I've said about GIMS is that GIMS is a treasure. And the women that have created GIMS are absolute living treasures. And that they should, all the progressives who are attracted to our work should really work for GIMS, in my view. And what I hope in the long term is that we can, so I've got a professorship at University of Helsinki. We're building a really progressive program in that university now. And I'm hoping we can, post-pandemic, if there is a post, we might be able to create a beachhead within an English university, or what's left of Britain. Who knows what's going to be left? But somewhere create a beachhead for GIMS to get academic status. But I urge all of the activist community to get behind the GIMS women and give them support and build a grassroots resistance movement. And Chris Williamson's going to have his Festival of Resistance. We were going to have it in May this year, but it's May. I'm hoping I can get over there. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to, but things like the Resistance Festival, he's bringing together lots of different people. If they can all talk with GIMS and get that happening, and build a political movement. I don't think, my view, and I know I get a lot of criticism over this, I don't see any use of putting energy into the British Labor Party anymore.
Sadly, I agree with you.
I think the institutional structure is not amenable to big progressive shifts. And I say the same thing about the Australian Labor Party. I think you've got the scope to, this is a turning point in history, really. And I think that's when new parties can emerge and big new citizens movements. And I think GIMS are a great organisational framework for, as well as I think Chris's Festival of Resistance will become, to really build a capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I love your phrase, national treasures. I mean, we'll be embarrassing the three ladies. I can't see them, but I genuinely, they always inspire me.
They're not going to be embarrassed.
Oh, well, that's good. I mean, they've inspired me, you know, giving me my associate status. You know, I'm one of the gang. I love to work for GIMS, you know, it's absolutely fantastic. I've left Labour. My activism is very much MMT, GIMS orientated, and you know, obviously, they're the future. Well, we're over the time, Bill. I don't know if there's any
questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Because they should have a chance to say something.
Well, I don't know if I can pass over to one of the GIMS girls. I don't know if I'm not very good at technology, Bill, but if I'm going to pass you over, I don't know what will happen, but it's been a great privilege. The time has passed so quick. But if they can click in, I don't know. I'll wait and see if anything happens.
Thanks, Phil. Take
care. I think Sarah sent you questions on your own chat. Phil?
Okay.
I can't. My screen's too far away to read the chat.
Phil, can you see the questions? Because I don't have them.
Okay.
No, I can't.
Let's have a look. There's a lot of comments, you see. That's my thing. I've got a long list of comments.
Well, maybe we'll see them. Maybe we'll see them in the.
I'll have a look. I can find a. Oh, I've got one new message. Is this going to be a? One final question I can find from Patricia. I'll ask you this then, Bill. I can see it. Here I go. In mainstream economics, we always hear economists describe people as economic actors seeking to maximize their happiness or utility, and resources are inherently scarce. How would you conceptualize MMT in their approach to people and resources? So there's a nice technical economics question for you, Bill.
Well, I mean, this is the one's the microeconomic conception of economic behaviour, and MMT is a macroeconomics for a start. But I mean, a heterodox view of humanity, which really is sympathetic to our macro. So, you know, most of us have come out of a heterodox tradition where we've been fighting out the microeconomic battle as well. And I think a sort of a reasonable heterodox rendition of humanity is that we're collective souls. We satisfice and not maximize. We don't have the analytical capacity to behave as Homo economicus. That's the sort of mainstream view of humanity, which no social psychologist or sociologist would identify with. We're not independent maximizers. We are always looking socially. You know, we're driven by what are called demonstration effects. So I think, I don't know if do you have this expression in Britain, keeping up with the Joneses?
We do, yes.
Yeah. So that's a demonstration effect. You know, we're social animals. We don't make decisions blithely without reference to our cohorts that we mix with. We're continually satisficing, which means that we just make do most of the time. In Australia, we have the expression, she'll be all right, mate. And she'll be, you know, we are highly irrational. We're not totally rational decision makers. We often make decisions that are not in our best interests, like we smoke cigarettes and drink to excess, and we don't socially distance in this current period. And above all, we operate in teams, starting off with our families, but then into society. We operate in teams, in workplaces, in education, in community groups, in sporting groups. And the idea, that's the way in which psychologists and sociologists identify humanity. And, if you then go on technically and expand on what that means, well, that means that almost all of the neoclassical microeconomic theory it can't be derived in any analytical, tractable way. Using the tools of neoclassical economics, the mathematical tools, we can't get the intertemporal maximisation, we can't get the transversality conditions defined, and all the rest of it. And moreover, we have no perception. We're in a world of endemic uncertainty. We don't know what the future is. We make guesstimates all the time, and we satisfy us with those guesstimates, and we operate on rules of thumb, habit, and custom, and we're not analytical in that way at all. So that's what I'd say to Patricia. Was that Patricia Pena?
Yeah, she's starting a new master's course, I believe. So
I know she is. Yeah, good on her.
It's a great effort, I think. So she's getting into the high-powered questions and asking.
Well, I've already given her advice, Patricia. I'm giving you advice again. If you want to get the conservative degree, don't rock the boat.
Yeah, wait till you get to a certain age before you become too rebellious. Right, Bill. Well, I think I'll wind up there. I'm sure Gims will get back to you. As I say, Neil and Neil's got a project in mind. We're going to try and recruit you for. I know your diary's very full, and there's an old saying, always ask a busy person. So
I've always got time for Gims. Let me say that publicly. I think they're a wonderful organisation, and they're your hope. I've always got time for them.
Yeah, well, we're all singing on the same sheet, I mean, I saw something of Sarah blushing like crazy. They shouldn't be, getting all these grumpy old men together and directing them in the right way. It takes some doing.
I'm not grumpy.
No, I'm talking about myself. It's my 40th year in teaching, and I mean, my PhD supervisor calls it a sentence, but I still like teaching, but you got to be grumpy. And I'm not the oldest. They're all old guys, and real grumpy. I've got a guy in the late 60s, 70 in our department. It's great. It's like the BBC show Grumpy Old Men. I don't know if you've ever seen that. That's what
I know of it. Yeah, I hardly watch TV.
Too busy. Well, I only watch one show really now, which is Mortimer and Whitehouse Gone Fishing, which in a sense, two old comedians going fishing and talking about their former lives. And it's great. I'll give that a plug, Right, Bill, I don't know if there's anything you want to give a parting shot to say goodbye.
No, thanks to the women of Gims. You've done it again. Thanks very much for all your work, and Prue, Claire and Sarah, and thanks to everybody who's given up their Sunday, I guess it's lunchtime, to listen to all of this, and let's all work together and do stuff and see if we can make progress.
Thank you, Bill and Phil. It's very kind of you to join us.
No worries. Take care and good night to everybody.
Thanks, Bill.